part of being able to disrupt it. So how would you say, what's the scale and magnitude of organized crime today?
Well, good afternoon for everyone, for the other members of panelists. Thank you for the question. I think it's very difficult to do that because usually you cannot measure very well crime. A lot of part of criminal activity goes into the shadows. But in general, we have strong perceptions about the risks of organized crime. I think organized crime is a problem all over the world. In Brazil, it's a big problem. We have this criminal organization usually based on state prisons. Some leaders also in federal prisons. And they are powerful, and they are violent. We have recently an episode in Brazil where some organizations in a state in the north of Brazil called Ceará started riots, acts of violence, like arsons, because they want to pressure the government to don't fight with them, don't make the prison system more rigid. So it's a large problem everywhere. What is necessary? Of course, in every country, we need to fight back, of course, with rule of law, respecting human rights, but if the resources are limited, we need to focus then on organized crime. Okay, some countries like Italy against the Cosa Nostra, United States against the 5 mafia families of New York, they have been successful addressing organized crime. This organization still exists, but not anymore as the same strength. The other countries have to do the same.
So I'll jump to... Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. You might not know it, but we're here to see the light. And this is serious because this session, Into the Dark, is all about shining a light on one of the world's most challenging topics. We are very fortunate to have world-leading experts on several nuances of this issue here with us today. So I'm Ilona Szabo, the co-founder of a Think and Do Tank that uses research and technology to tackle global issues such as security, climate change, and migrations. I'll be your chair today. So we'll start this session actually with Mr. David Craig, who is sitting right here. He's the CEO from Refinitiv. Mr. David will set the scene for us and show one of the sides of organized crime and also just how data can be used to disrupt it. And then we're going to have a conversation with our 3 panelists. I'll start with Mr. Sergio Moro. Sergio Moro today is probably the world's most known corruption fighter, if I could call. A former judge, today a Minister for Justice and Public Security in Brazil. Then we're going to have Mrs. Karin von Hippel, that is an expert in counterterrorism, stabilization, and U.S. foreign policy. Today, she's the Director General of the Royal United Services Institute for Defense and Security Studies in the UK, that also does research on organized crime. We also have Mr. Jürgen Stock, who doubles as a law enforcement officer and a professor of law and criminology. And since 2014, he has served as the Secretary General of Interpol. So please, you also can follow along on social media using the hashtag WEF19. After the discussion, we're also going to pose questions. The audience can participate in our discussion. So over to you, David, please.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much. I'm very privileged to be here, particularly with this distinguished panel. My name is David Craig. I'm Chief Executive of Refinitiv. You may not have heard of Refinitiv. We're only 100 days old. Mm-hmm. We're a data company. We actually came out of a company, though, with 160 years history of providing data to global financial markets. We do that today. We do that every day. On a day like today, we'll collect 40 to 50 billion updates and send that around to 190 countries. We collect over 1 petabyte of data a day. So we're a big, important data company, and we have a privilege to help run the financial markets and make them more efficient and more effective. 18 years ago, we recognized the enormous challenge that was growing around the financial system and financial crime. So 18 years ago, we started building risk intelligence. How do we start collecting information on the bad actors, the risky actors, the people involved in financial crime, basically to help the banks to be the policemen, to stop the transactions, to prevent them opening accounts, to do that. We do that today. We have a risk intelligence database of well over 4 million entities with the networks, and it's used to screen over 150 to 200 million entities every single day. So that's our position. But I want to now talk about the human part of financial crime. I think financial crime is really badly branded. It sounds like an accounting fraud. It sounds like something quite technical. But actually, when you really get underneath, which we will do with a panel, what's going on, there are real people at the end of these supply chains. So when you look, obviously, at terrorist financing or illicit financing for drug trafficking, it's very clear that there are human consequences to these issues. But 3 years ago, we started to recognize the importance of human trafficking. And we started to add into our database and our risk intelligence and the algorithms that we use with artificial intelligence to track them, the entities involved in human trafficking. And it's a shocking number, but it's the fastest and growing entity set on our database. And it is a well-known estimate that there are around 40 million victims today of modern slavery in the world. 40 million. That's 5 times the population of Switzerland. Yet slavery is illegal everywhere. So clearly, this is a huge global problem, and the financial system has an extraordinary role to play in this because, of course, if you stop the money, you stop the flow of the people. What we have done is taken our risk database, and I'm going to show you a video now, the first time this has ever been shown, where we've taken the entities involved in human trafficking and mapped where they're based and where they're sending the traffickers to. It's a great example of how artificial intelligence can build an intelligence map and help the financial system and the corporates and the government agencies really start to target where are these entities, what are they doing, how do we stop the money flows to cut off the source of this terrible, terrible social problem. So I'm going to show the video now, allow you to see that, and then we'll be handing back to the panel to discuss this important topic. Thank you. Yep.
So we'll just, I think, start our discussion. First, I would like to thank David because in general, you don't relate organized crime, financial crime with human suffering. And I think it's time for us to understand all these nuances because the answers will be, I think, more efficient. So I'll start with Moro. From your experience, can we know the exact scale and magnitude of organized crime? I think knowing the problem is part of being able to disrupt it. So how would you say, what's the scale and magnitude of organized crime today?
Well, good afternoon for everyone, for the other members of panelists. Thank you for the question. I think it's very difficult to do that because usually you cannot measure very well crime. A lot of part of criminal activity goes into the shadows. But in general, we have strong perceptions about the risks of organized crime. I think organized crime is a problem all over the world. In Brazil, it's a big problem. We have this criminal organization usually based on state prisons. Some leaders also in federal prisons. And they are powerful and they are violent. We have recently an episode in Brazil where some organizations in a state in the north of Brazil called Ceará started riots, acts of violence like arsons because they want to pressure the government to don't fight with them, don't make the system the prison system more rigid. So it's a large problem everywhere. What is necessary? Of course, in every country, we need to fight back, of course, with rule of law, respecting human rights, but if the resources are limited, we need to focus then on organized crime. Okay, some countries like Italy against the Cosa Nostra, United States against the 5 mafia families of New York, they have been successful addressing organized crime. This organization still exists, but not anymore as the same strength. The other countries have to do the same.
So I'll jump to Mr. Jürgen and go back to you, Karen. Is it possible today for police forces to dismantle these groups? Like, are police equipped in an era of cryptocurrencies, deep web? How would you just resonate to this question of police preparedness?
Thank you very much for having me. And it's interesting to move from a more cyber-centric discussions we have had so far here in Davos to a maybe classical crime type, which definitely is organized crime in all its various forms, like drug trafficking, of course, which exists quite a while without that much significant changes. We still see, for instance, with regards to cocaine, South America be the main place for production. Very often then the drugs go through different parts of Africa. It depends on the law enforcement response, which also goes to your question. We see heroin, still the main producer is of Afghanistan. Still we know Balkan route as a way where drugs are moved into Europe. So there are classical crime types and there are new crime types. I think for law enforcement, the challenge is still that we are successfully in organizing specific targeted operations. And Interpol last year, for instance, we have been organizing more than 50, not only cross-international, but cross-continental operations where we have been trying not only to catch those who are, let's say, doing the criminal frontline work, so the trafficking of human beings or the carrying of drugs, but the masterminds behind, those who are far away very often, who are providing the financial means and who are in the back organizing these issues. So I think we are very successful on the one hand, many examples for successful operations that, for instance, last year were Interpol led, and we have a lot of plans for this year. We have been helping member countries to build the capabilities they need and to train police officers to have the knowledge to run these international operations. But if you would ask me, is global law enforcement really prepared? My answer would be perhaps no, not really. We still have to work on that. And I'm very grateful that many of the developed countries are helping financially Interpol to provide the necessary support for those countries who need to have that kind of support. I think the challenge, and that makes Davos so interesting, is, and maybe we can dig a little deeper into that subject matter, is how do we make sure that we have a kind of sustainable impact in what we are doing, that we are not just conducting a single operation and maybe few weeks later we have taken a few of these criminals away, they are in jail, and suddenly there are new people available, which obviously for criminal groups is not that much a problem to get new people who are carrying drugs and so on and so on. So how do we organize ourselves in a way that we have sustainable long-term impact and really mitigate and reduce the crime? And of course, now I'm coming back to the cyber issue, the same applies for classical organized crime. We need to find new ways to co-create security, which of course requires close cooperation amongst law enforcement with other public entities who have responsibilities, whether it's custom, whether it's any specialized units. We need to increase our cooperation with the private sector to find solutions together. And of course, the banking sector is one of these examples to identify the financial flows of this illegal money. And I'd also want to mention, because that's important in our daily work, cooperation with NGOs who, for instance, are fighting poaching, environmental crime in Africa. Yeah. We have seen that the close cooperation with these NGOs is very beneficial, that we can find a good legal basis for exchanging information. So again, our structures are still built for silo-oriented work, and we have to overcome the silo mentality, and we have to enter into a more institutionalized way of cooperating at a national level, at a regional level, and at a global level. And I think one of the sentences here was, the problem is global, yes, and that makes global platforms like Interpol so important, and also global platforms like the World Economic Forum, which is an opportunity for me to be here and to set up these partnerships which are needed to really have a sustainable impact and really reducing organized crime, and not just, one operation after the other without really a significant impact.
For sure. I think you touched so many issues that we will unpack all of this. I'll give Karen the chance to also resonate to all that was said. RUSI, your institution, does a lot of research on organized crime, and I think we've seen a bit of the magnitude and different variations. Could you tell us about your research?
Yeah, thank you, Ilona, and thank you for welcoming me here today. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's great to be sitting with two practitioners as well as another scholar. At RUSI, we have a fairly big team doing a range of research on organized crime, and it really, we look at everything from the drugs trade in East and West Africa. We look at cigarette, alcohol, and pharmaceutical illicit trade in those products. We do work on the illegal wildlife trade, and that also includes illegal fishing, which we view, we think should be perceived as much more of an organized crime, serious organized crime. And then we also have been doing some work on modern slavery. So if I could just I went through a bunch of our work, and I've got a big stack here, so if anybody wants to take any of our studies home. I went through a bunch of our work, and I come up with four key findings that I wanted to share, because I think it might help frame the conversation a bit more today. And in fact, many of these findings really resonate if you look at counterterrorism, and I know you, Jürgen, you do work in both of those. So the first one is, obviously there's been a growth in the volume and the complexity of organized crime, especially with cybercrime. There is much more polycriminality, which means that the same person is, shipping drugs, people, and drugs, people, and firearms, for example, in the same shipment. There is often the illegal fishing will use slave labor, so it's sort of polycriminality, two things happening at once. Corruption is, of course, a key enabler, and you know a lot more about that. For us, we're not entirely sure. It'd be interesting to hear more from both of you if the threat is increasing or if just the reporting is getting better and we're getting better at understanding the threat, even though most crime still goes unreported. So it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on that. So that's our first, it's a growth in volume and complexity of organized crime. The second finding is there have been shifts in the structures of organized crime, and I'm sure both of you have seen that, evolving from really more traditional hierarchical groups to more network-centric, loose, undefined, and flexible networks, often using people just on an ad hoc basis, one-off, so it makes it much harder to track for law enforcement. And then, so that's the second one, these major shifts. The third is, as Ilona, you were saying at the start, the increasingly globalized phenomenon, and as you just mentioned as well, of organized crime, so that the change in geopolitics in one region can have a very big impact in another. Just two quick examples. In 2015, 2016, when we saw the vast migration flow across Europe, starting from Syria, but really many other countries, people from countries such as Iraq, Eritrea, and Afghanistan really jumped on board, and we saw a huge shift in organized crime just based on that one real big geopolitical change. A related one is, of course, often organized crime will shift based on legitimate global supply chains and how those shift. And so it'll be very interesting to see if the impact of Brexit will make a difference here. And then the fourth finding that I wanted to mention is in terms of cybercrime and the growing digital dimension of organized crime and increased use of encrypted technologies, very similar again to terrorism, that it lowers the bar to entry and it widens the profile of perpetrators. So you can have the kid hacking in his bedroom, you can have some middle-class person going onto the dark web and having something delivered to their door. You can have people selling illicit cigarettes over Facebook, and I think we've seen a lot in the news on that recently. And I think as David was pointing out earlier, we have a lot more digital evidence in the past, but law enforcement, and we found in our work in the UK, is not always as good at aggregating and interpreting and managing that data, and maybe David's company will hopefully help all of us. And then the final point related to the growing the use of the web is, I think law enforcement often finds it difficult to retain the talent to help in this space because they're competing with the private sector.
Perfect. I mean, when we just look at all these silos, I would like to ask Minister Moro, he's just led a major anti-money laundering investigation with the international implications. So what would be the main lessons for international cooperation from from a case that started locally but just had so many international implications?
I think there are some things that could be improved on that area. Nowadays, a lot of countries have a lot of mutual agreements or multilateral agreements, but sometimes these agreements doesn't not work in practice. They are used sometimes like a piece of paper to say, oh, you have agreement, I will cooperate, but in practice it's very difficult. Maybe one way to improve the relationship between law enforcement personnel from one country to another is to create joint teams. Yes, confidence, trust between law enforcement personnel is very important. And sometimes it's difficult for someone in Brazil to trust in someone in another country or vice versa. Also, I really think that the private sector could do more on this issue. I also remember a case that I have in the past. We are investigating money laundering in Brazil, and some professionals in money laundering used a branch of a state bank in Miami to launder money for politicians, for businessmen, for criminals, for everyone, to be honest. They usually don't separate this sort of things. They are not worried about. And at that time, it was 2000, 4, we don't have a mutual agreement with the United States. And this bank, Brazilian bank, with a branch in Miami, we approached the bank, and the bank itself requests a court order in a United States court to get a judicial authorization to take the bank records and deliver it to Brazilian law enforcement. I realize that nowadays the international cooperation is based in cooperation between governments, cooperation between law enforcement personnel. But is this really necessary? If you are a corporation in the private sector, if you don't want that your company be used for criminal purpose, usually you want to cooperate. You could cooperate with your national law enforcement, but maybe building some basic measures, you could also cooperate with law enforcement authorities from other countries. Why you need to follow all the diplomatic channels? If you need that, when you need usually coercive measures to take a deposition, to take bank records, to get this kind of evidence. But if the cooperation is voluntary, maybe you could work directly with law enforcement personnel of other countries. Maybe that it would be a way to, to improve international cooperation, not only between governments, but between law enforcement personnel from a country to corporations of another country. I really think this is a possibility. I also make a suggestion here in that PASSE initiative. For example, if you are committed to cooperate, if you are committed to not let your company become a haven to criminals, you should cooperate. You should do more than just write moral principles in your corporate manuals. You need to do more. And to be honest, this is good not only for international cooperation, it's good for the companies, it's good for profits, it's good for the people, it's good for everyone.
I'll just challenge Jürgen. Do you think, is there any specific case where this direct cooperation already happens between private sector or different police institutions with companies and governments without the legal framework?
Yes, of course, there is a lot going on. For instance, we have in Singapore, thanks to a generous donation from the state of Singapore, we have a nice building, Interpol Global Complex for Innovation. And we have been developing this hub as a hub for public-private partnership. So we have currently 15 global players, global companies, who have been seconding experts into our teams. And we are working on collecting relevant information, so data analytics, so to understand the bigger picture of crime. So inviting our member countries to provide their intelligence and providing the necessary analysis. And we do it what we call a desk-by-desk approach, which is very much similar with what is being done in many, for instance, major cities around the world, where this kind of community policing approach, or I know a famous criminologist from the US, Herman Goldstein, who spoke about a problem-oriented approach. So the simple question is, do we have a common understanding what the problem looks like, and who can contribute to fix the problem? Specifically important if you want to tackle a problem at the source, then everybody understands it requires really not just a whole of government approach, but a whole of society approach. If you really want to address the root causes, and we all know how difficult that is. But I think this is the right, let's say, philosophy which we try to use on a global level. So trying to describe and to understand the problem of modern slavery on a global level, illegal fishery, you mentioned that, which is really putting a lot of threat on whole economies in Southeast Asia, for instance. So understanding the implications of a problem and asking us who can contribute to solve the problem. So this means we invite public sector, we invite the private sector, and we invite NGOs to build these teams, task force oriented, and trying to have sustainable impact. So really trying to reduce the phenomena. And I think this is the right way to go. And we also have to adapt our rules and regulations, because we spoke about trust on various occasions here. Trust also comes from having a clear legal framework that everybody, also the people in our countries, understand what the hell are they doing. If they are sitting together, what kind of information are they sharing, at least at the police level. And I'm only talking about police. That needs to take place in a very transparent way, so that people put trust in the system and also provide information, because we rely on information. And maybe that sentence, organized crime, yes, indeed. The more resources police puts into the phenomena, the more cases are popping up. We saw that a little bit in some countries after 9/11, where capabilities were shifted into counterterrorism, and suddenly the crime rates in organized crime were dropping down. And was that a real decrease? Of course not.
Thank you so much. And Karin, from the policy perspectives, policy recommendations you have, by listening to Mr. Moro and Jürgen, what would you say is missing there, or is just your comments on those?
Yeah, I mean, I actually, just to really reinforce what both of them have been saying, I don't think it's rocket science. It's just that because things are so complex, we need to be bringing groups together, as you said, who don't traditionally come together. I think in the UK, law enforcement and the financial sector have been coming together and sharing information very successfully. Often it's just these cultures speak different languages, right? We see this so often when you try to bring people from different silos, as you said. There was a very good example that I'm sure you know much more about, and with one of these multi-agency task forces in Thailand, right, to really deal with illegal fishing. So there's lots of examples, positive examples, and I think think tanks and others can also try to highlight those positive examples. Obviously we devote a lot of energy to this and bringing in these vast different communities. So it's communities that don't always talk to each other in countries, civil society, private sector, government, law enforcement, and then of course cross countries, as you were saying, and making sure that you're getting cooperation between source countries, transit countries, and destination countries as well. So it's sort of a mix of that. And then I think for us, our last one that we have been focusing on at RUSI is following the money, and I think David mentioned that earlier as well. We use a financial intelligence lens to look at a number of these types. So whether it's modern slavery, illicit wildlife trafficking, North Korean proliferation. In fact, we are looking at the shipping industry, we're looking at the insurance industry, and the more you follow the money, it's not just financial crime where you should follow the money to learn.
So just taking on that, Moro, when you talk about following the money, and of course this I think was the thread that led to the anti-corruption Lava Jato, which is the car wash, how do you think these tools could be applied to fighting the same drug factions that you were mentioning in the beginning? So the organized crime that Mr. Jürgen was mentioning, like the real one on the streets. I mean, we know they're all interlinked, but can we use the same tools? What else is missing there that we can't, we didn't find out yet how to really just dismantle these groups?
Well, there is no magic against these organized crime groups. As I said earlier, you need resources. I think the best strategy is to creating a task force. You need technology. I think this is very important. And you have that classical approach. You need effective investigation to get strong evidence against the leaders. Then you have to isolate the leaders, usually in prisons with high security levels. You have to dismantle the organization, not only sending to prison the other members, but also forfeiting their assets. Sometimes it's difficult to follow the money, it's not that simple. But they work as other criminals works. The money have to go to somewhere. But let me say a little more about what my suggestion before. I was thinking here about the technology that used in cars, Uber. And you have, in the past, license for taxis.
Yeah.
Then you have a platform, a digital platform. Then you don't need anymore the government to say that they're reliable. I was thinking about something similar. You have maybe a digital platform. So corporations go in this platform and they say, oh, we are available to cooperate with law enforcement personnel all around the world. We, not necessarily you need cooperation by our government. Like that example that I said there, let's think about a bank in Brazil who has a branch in another country, and I know that this branch has evidence that I needed, bank records, for example. Why don't thinking about going to this platform, this bank is in this platform, and this bank provide obtaining authorization from their courts, or the courts on of the country where the evidence is held, and the bank itself provide what the law enforcement really need. Maybe it's something that we could think about to do something different. Because, as I said, we have a lot of mutual agreements. Sometimes they are on a piece of papers. They don't work in practice. And as I said, if corporations are talking serious about cooperation with law enforcement and avoid any kind of involvement with criminals, they could cooperate more. The criminals don't know boundaries. Corporations usually don't know even. Only governments have these problems. So corporations could cooperate more in voluntary means.
I'd love to hear the audience about this because I'm sure there's a lot of corporations here, but I'm just going to give back before opening to questions to Mr. David Craig. David, just also I think from the private sector and the partnership perspective, if you could just comment and add your perspectives on those.
Yeah, and just listening to what people are saying, we've had many years' experience working in this, and there has been a change, but there's a big problem. As Jürgen said, this is global, and these organizations are global, and the networks are amazing, as we found with our research. They're big and profitable. We've estimated from the entities that we tracked, just that you saw in that film, 150 billion turnover. To put that in perspective, that's almost as big as Apple. There's an arms race in technology. The technology that they're deploying is more sophisticated and available than the technology that the regulators and the enforcement agencies, and that arms race is important. But I think the most important thing I wanted to say was around data and collaboration. So we talked about trust and collaboration. I'll give one example. So a few years ago, the focus of the financial institutions was compliance. We don't want to get fined, and rightly so after some of the big fines. And so they would, on seeing something suspicious, immediately file what's called a SAR, a suspicious activity report. Everyone knows in the industry about these. In the US, I think last year there were 1.5 million SARs filed. Too many for any regulator to understand. Because the banks were taking a risk approach. Let's just make sure we file something, we reported it, we're done. Karen mentioned the UK. Under the GIMLIT now, what's happened is the enforcement agencies in the UK, when the banks see something, actually go in and look. And they don't shut down the network. They actually observe and they watch and they start to trace. And that requires a different mindset of collaboration between enforcement, the financial industry, and the regulators. And that's what we're pushing through our collaboration with RUSI and Europol and others, is how do we get to a more trust-based collaboration so that we can, frankly, compete on a global network basis to the way that the criminal networks are. We can create lots of data, and we do that in the private sector, but it's useless unless enforcement agencies and the financial sector and the authorities can get to a place where they work together to discover the networks. There's some very good examples, but it does require a different way of working than what we've done in the past.
Absolutely, thank you so much. So now I would like to take some questions, please. If you could introduce yourself.
Johan Elias, I have a company. I own a company called Head, which does sporting goods, and I have some other corporate activities. But I was also a member of the British government for a while as the Prime Minister's special representative on climate change, which got me in contact with countries where these problems were very prevalent in South America, Africa, and the Far East. And Mr. Moro touched on one very important point, and that is if you want to trace money from organized crime, it's usually too late when you get the answers, because it's a process that takes a very long time. And if you try to circumvent it, in many jurisdictions, if you have obtained the information illegally, your case falls flat. And in my experience, there is a necessity to have a global treaty that addresses this, because to address organized crime, the only way to do that is to cut off the money, in my opinion. So I would very much like to hear the panel's opinion on how that could be achieved.
Yeah, I mean, if I quickly may say, of course you are right in your observation that money drives organized crime, and of course all the different phenomena we are talking about are itself multi-billion criminal industries. It's huge, and normally they operate under the radar, and it's very, very difficult to dismantle these activities. So, but I think there's no alternative than establishing a strong cooperation. That's what we try to do on a global level. For instance, with financial intelligence units, who are quite well established now, almost all around the world. Financial Action Task Force, so to establish a close cooperation with associations, the banking sector, and of course also hoping that artificial intelligence will provide us some opportunities to identify and detect these illegal flows as early as possible, and combining that, by the way, with very classical police work, which is taking fingerprints, photos and DNA from criminals and making sure that this information is available at the front lines of policing, border stations. But we are establishing a pilot currently with some banks and with some hotels, where based on the national legal situation and Interpol's rules and regulations, we provide direct access to police information to the banking sector. So in case somebody wants to open an account that perhaps the bank sees, this is perhaps a criminal, and maybe I should inform the police. Very, very simply speaking, but I think by doing that, we try to be as early and as fast as possible, that intervention is possible before the next click on a mouse has taken place and the money is on the next continent. So I actually share your view, and I count on, in the combination of classical police work and new technologies and a new spirit of cooperation, we can address that issue.
We don't want problems with the exclusionary rule. That's not what I was talking. I was just talking that maybe sometimes if you cannot use the mutual agreements channels, the diplomatic channels, maybe you could use something different. For example, if a corporation for another country voluntarily cooperate with law enforcement personnel of other country, there's no problem with the evidence. It's different from having evidence without a warrant or without a probable cause. For example, I know that this employee of this corporation, he could be involved in criminal activity. It would be valuable for me to have a statement, the position. The corporate itself could provide the position if necessary, requesting authorization for a court, or maybe it's not even necessary to do this. So you would improve international cooperation. Because to be honest, there are some countries that really does not cooperate in practice, even when you have a mutual legal agreement. Sometimes the fault is on the poor quality of the international request, but sometimes it's a problem of a lack of goodwill.
Can I just one point about just to reinforce what Jürgen was saying about the use of AI and machine learning in some of our work as well with the police in the UK, that we found they weren't exploiting the large amounts of data available to them. And so I think making better use, and there's a lot of AI expertise here at Davos as well.
Sure. Any other question?
I'm Christina from Brazil. Brazilian Central Bank is proposing to stop financial monitoring of politicians' relatives. I'd like to ask the panelists, what is the rule in countries like Germany and the UK, and what is Minister Moro's personal opinion, please?
Well, I read in the newspapers today about this question, but as far as I know, what I read is that it's just a public consult. It's not an actual measure. So respecting the rulers of the central bank, we have to understand better why they are proposing such kind of measure. I really believe that they have we are not talking about the actual government. We are talking about rulers of the central bank from the former government, because the president was not changed yet, okay? So we have to understand better why they are proposing this, and then we could maybe discuss with them if it's really a good idea. But I really believe that maybe they are not proposing the right thing, but they have good intents.
Like to comment, Jürgen?
No, not really, because I mean we are not entering into national issues. We provide a platform for police cooperation which can be used. So I think the other panel members are in a much better position to.
It's not. It's about that special attention directed by the financial system to financial records of politicians. And they are trying to discuss the actual rule about relatives of politicians. But it's too soon to have a conclusive statement about this proposition. It was open to the public, just that.
There's one more question here in the front.
Lourdes Casanova from Cornell University. It was yesterday that Moises Naim mentioned this statistic, 8:31. So Latin America concentrates 8% of the world population, and 1 in 3 of the homicides in the world take care in Latin America. The explanations were around inequality, poverty, but if we look at India, for instance, has many more poor, but the statistics show that it's a much, much safer country. Also, democracy like Latin American countries. Inequality, we have inequality in many other parts of the world. Any other number one, reasons and possible solutions, because as you are saying, Minister Moro, right now the new government is facing these challenges from Ciara again.
Well, we have problems with violence in South America, not only in Brazil, but in other countries, usually high rates of homicide. It's a problem difficult to address. What I can say, I took this position with this compromise to change things. The first idea is to address grand corruption, because Brazil is probably the country who did more against corruption in the last 4 years than respecting every other country, but than any other country. And also Brazil cooperate with a lot of other countries, even in South America, in Latin America, Mexico, Colombia, Peru, with evidence about corruption committed by Brazilian enterprise abroad. But if you look at the details, you will realize that it was a work of law enforcement personnel, policemen, prosecutors, and judges. You haven't seen nothing substantial from the federal government. So I think this has to change. The federal government has the main responsibility to address this kind of problems. And between a lot of things that we intend to do, we want to present a bill in the beginning of the new Congress with measures against not only grand corruption, but also organized crime and violent crime. Because, to be honest, these things are related. Organized crime, how it was said here, use bribes to escape justice. Organized crime, a great part of homicides in Brazil is related to drug trafficking, to commercial disputes involving drugs. So if you have to deal with the problem, you have to deal with these 3 points. I hope that it will work. That's my intention. But things don't change abruptly. We need to start a cyclus, a virtuous cycle in Brazil to change things. It will be a hard job.
And this issue touches me personally very much, but I know that's not the main theme of the session, but I think understanding the connections will help us to address better this problem, that's for sure. So would anyone else would like to pose a question? Please.
There's been a lot of talk of collaboration and cooperation among countries. How do you make them do it?
Would you like to start, maybe Karen, from the policy, I'll say civil society lens, just to provoke a little bit here?
Look, it's a great question. I think, at some level, the law enforcement agencies have a high incentive to cooperate because they want to demonstrate that they are succeeding in this. The challenges, there's just so many places in this chain, the security chain or the financial chain where something can fall through. So as you were saying, it's, you have the criminal justice side that needs to be reinforced. You have the prevent side on the other extreme. And then in the middle, you have, capturing people. And across all of these different areas, you need to be collaborating more. I do think that there's an important public information part of this work. And I think getting the public to understand better, why all these different types of organized crime really do impact everyone. I think, for example, just on the illicit cigarette smuggling work we've done, people think, oh, that's kind of a victimless crime, right? But in fact, there are lots of ramifications from illicit contraband and counterfeit crime networks, and enormous sums of money go into this. I think we were saying, what percentage of the GDP or the global GDP is
2 to 5 is the
I mean,
official figure.
it's huge, right? Yep. So, or if you think about trafficking, human trafficking, or human slavery, getting public to be aware of what to look for as well. So I do think there's a public communications component too, as well. But there's no simple answer, unfortunately.
Yeah, but I think Karen just touched on a very important point. I mean, if people don't feel they are affected, and that's why I think in the beginning also the presentation showing how financial crime also drive human suffering, I think to put your practical experience to just show the faces of the people that are actually being affected by these groups that are in our imaginary system. They're in the day-to-day life of everyone. More in developing countries, less in developed countries. But I think would it help your work, Jürgen and Moro, in terms of like if the public would understand and also take, I think, different choices when they're buying, something smuggled, or when they're doing something that they shouldn't be doing, even if it's small, but we know that contributes to this, just the chains. How would you feel that a part of the public information and the civil society awareness could help?
I think public awareness helps a lot because perhaps everybody can contribute to help. I mean, perhaps not solving the problem, but reducing the problem perhaps more than people might think. So I mean, speaking as a police officer, of course, we have naturally that's what we learn, that we want to solve problems and cases. We want to know who has been conducting a crime. And in today's world, everybody understands that this can only be done on a regional or even on a global level. That's actually what we are talking about in Interpol. And I can tell you, in all countries, whether they are well equipped and well trained or still have a lot to do, there's a great spirit actually of collaboration. The problem, of course, is a lack of capacity. The problem is a lack of proper training. The lack is a lack of communication means. I said it today in another context that we have some police services where we pay monthly the bill for electricity and internet access that they can have a chance to communicate with the other 193 member countries. So we are talking about the whole span, but this span is important because criminals and terrorists are using every weak link in our chain will be used and exploited by criminals. And we spoke about these illegal trafficking routes which are used for any commodity. So as you said, criminals are flexible. Another interesting thing is the link between terrorism and organized crime. And cyber, so for instance, the use of counterfeited fake passports is a very big issue, but also provides opportunities to detect if there is a sensitivity in the banking sector, who is opening an account, in the tax office, if you deal with tax issues, in any other administrative office. When people understand we have our primarily role to play, but we can also contribute to fix that problem if we cooperate with another unit. And so this spirit of cooperation and building these task force-like groups, I think that's what we need. So your question is very simple, but it's a very complex issue.
Just follow up and say, it seems to me that people are very concerned that this is my sensitive data and I don't dare share it with anybody.
I think this has been changing. When I was a young police officer, maybe I was educated in that way. It's my case, my data, and I need to keep that. And I'm not sharing it with the guys in the other town. I think this doesn't exist anymore. Everybody understands that there is a need to share and not a need to keep. So we need to share the information. And today on a global level, that's the challenge, what the minister has been indicating. And of course, the very different law systems in around the world, of course, they are not making things easier, as the minister illustrated, and I think he has a rich experience on that. So harmonization is an issue. Standardization of our police processes is an issue, that a piece of evidence that is collected in Brazil can then later be used in Switzerland. So we have many examples in the heterogeneous European Union framework, where we have this joint investigation task force, European arrest warrant, many instruments, and we have to step by step also apply these instruments on the global level. And Interpol, we already have these tools, and we have the agreement. We have a rules of processing of data network, which is very much oriented to European data protection law. So there are great opportunities to effectively address the phenomena.
I would add that it's necessary to build trust. And maybe the best way to do that is creating joint teams between law enforcement personnel from both countries involved or the several countries involved. Because what he's saying is true. Sometimes it's difficult even to get cooperation from law enforcement personnel inside of your own country. In Brazil, we have a classic problem. We have a federal police, we have a state police, and what's more complicated, we have in the States military police, and we have civil police, and sometimes they work together, and other times they don't even talk with each other because they don't rely in each other. So you have to build trust. Of course, sometimes, and I'm not speaking here about the situation in Brazil, we have a problem worldwide with corruption that affects not only high politicians, but public employees from a lot of branches of government, including police officers. So you have to build trust. Sometimes, let me say, these international conferences, they are good opportunities to meet people. Then later you can build a strong relationship. I met him yesterday. We talked a lot.
To start a new partnership.
It was a good conversation.
Yeah, and of course your country is now also helping establishing these platforms on the South American continent to bring the forces together. I mean, these are the practical examples that have impact in individual cases, but also what I mentioned, having this sustainable impact and really trying to reduce a phenomena and not to cut, chop one head after the other, and it's coming back like the Hydra phenomena.
And you don't need to start with, for example, huge cases of organized crime or big cases of corruption. You could start with small cases at the boundaries of each country. Then you start doing something. We have for years mutual agreements with some countries like Argentina, Paraguay, Colombia, but we have never had a joint team. Well, you have to start it. Then we will build more, you will build stronger relationship between the police of the two countries.
So on this positive note, I'll have to wrap up just saying, of course, we've seen the scale, the magnitude, the different faces of organized crime, but also I think now we see positive developments. I think understanding that the bad guys cooperate, the good guys have to cooperate. And I would just like to take these disruptive models that Mr. Moro was putting at the table further, at least as a brainstorming, how could we have the global agreement, but also more practical experiences that we could just work from. So start like that. So thank you so much for the panelists and for the audience, and we hope to continue this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.